Welcome everybody to another episode of Congress to Cubicle, where we look at the efficiency and effectiveness and credibility of our federal government and its programs. For years, we've been talking about civil service reform, and we dance around the edges with it. We don't quite get there. There's the complaints of the workforce. There's the complaints of managers and agencies and Congress and the administration for getting there, but we don't quite get there. First, we really need to build the capacity to reform our civil service. We can't just jump in and do that. We have a world of work that's changing. I mean, obviously we were impacted by COVID and needing to work at home, and we need policies and rules and regulations around that. And certainly return to work and how we go about doing that, or what flexibilities we continue to allow employees. But the future and how people want to work, the ability where some people want to be part of a gig workforce and work on projects and move from agency to agency, or be portable enough to move in and out of government. Allow government agencies to meet immediate needs of their mission, whether it's a natural disaster that comes up or something like COVID, or the Census Bureau needing to gear up to count and having the flexibilities to be able to do that. There's a lot of needs where agencies, just like in the private sector now, where they flex up and can flex back down when needed to get there. We have a tremendous federal workforce that needs to be honored and respected in terms of the role that they play and how they're compensated and respected in their process. We've got a workforce that is younger than any workforce in any other government. Less than 6% of our workforce is under age 30. Where in the private sector, under age 30 workforce is 24%. Other national governments, when you look at them, are in the 18, 20, 22%, where our US federal government is much different. Our IT workforce under age 30 is less than 2%. And we need to address that. And in a lot of cases, we've addressed that with a contractor workforce. And there's absolute needs for contractor workforce, but we've never really looked at where that spills over to inherently government work and where we should be restructuring and rebuilding our federal workforce along those lines. We don't know how much money is spent on human capital. We know we have a $300 billion payroll budget, which includes payroll and benefits, but we don't know how much is spent on brick and mortar for HR services, training, technology. We know there's a tremendous amount of fragmentation. Human capital management has been on the GAO High Risk list for over 20 years. That we've got a workforce that needs to be inspired and honored to come on board. And administrative attention and congressional oversight is needed to get there. So joining me today to discuss this is Terry Gerton, who's the president of the National Academy of Public Administration. Let's first talk about the NAPA report a little bit. How did that come about? What was the purpose of it, and how did that whole thing come about?
Well, I think to be really clear, Steve, while you set the stage to talk about human capital reform writ large, our focus really was on the Office of Personnel Management. Back in 2018, the Trump administration made that proposal to significantly realign federal human capital management and to move OPM's policy functions to OMB and other functions to GSA. And the rationale that they provided was that OPM was not structured or resourced to carry out its mission in a sustainable and secure manner. So they had this proposal, and in response to that, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020 required OPM and their director to contract with the Academy for an assessment of OPM itself. What were its statutory responsibilities? Was it accomplishing those? Had it taken on other missions that it hadn't been assigned, and perhaps were those distracting from its ability to accomplish its statutory mission? And then they asked the academy to look at how it should be organized and how much it would cost to run it the way it ought to be run. So our focus was not on civil service reform per se, but to really look at what it would take to make OPM the organization it was always envisioned to be, so that that effective organization could begin the process of civil service reform.
Well, that makes sense. And there's so much complement between our two studies and reports. While we took a broader look at human capital reform, we have a recommendation that zeroed in on some of the same things for OPM. And I was struck after reading the NAPA report how consistent we were with some of the recommendations. NAPA did a little bit better job identifying specific legislative areas that should be amended or changed. We took a little bit more of a wholesale approach and certainly getting there, but identifying things like the difficulty in leadership turnover at OPM that lacked consistency since 2013. Certainly the lack of data analytic capacity or even strategic capacity to look at the needs of human capital across the board into the future and prepare for that as we go forward. But you, within that construct, how do you envision some of those how did NAPA envision some of those strategic elements to take place?
Well, we started with the idea that OPM needs a broader scope of responsibility. And so one of the first statutory changes that we suggested was that Congress specifically make them responsible for overseeing the entire federal workforce system, not just Title V. Because over time, of course, as you know, the system has gotten so complex. And because it hasn't operated smoothly, agencies have frequently sought exceptions from Congress in statute to give them the freedom of maneuver that they needed to accomplish their missions. So our very first recommendation was that OPM should be reframed as the strategic human capital manager for the federal government, and that they should have that responsibility in statute for all the federal civil service provisions, and that the OPM director should be a strategic advisor to the president on human capital management, just as private sector companies think about the strategy of human capital and talent management. And a private sector director of HR is the strategic advisor to the principal of a corporation, because people are a strategic asset. So the very first thing we wanted to do was kind of reframe the conversation about what OPM should be, to have them be that strategic oversight responsibility, have that strategic oversight responsibility for the federal government. So once you take that step, then many of the rest follow, right? That they should, the OPM director should be selected based on qualifications and expertise in talent management and human capital. That the Office of Personnel Management should rebuild, as you addressed, their strategic planning and guidance capability. That they should do that for all federal agencies, regardless of size, free of charge, which means, of course, that they have to be funded to do that, not on a fee-for-service basis, but through appropriations. That as the owner of the data on the federal civil service, they should really be the ones that do the data analytics, that simplify that, so that they can provide guidance to the federal agencies, both on trends and gaps, and inform the decisions that the agencies make about how to manage their talent workforce. And then another big change that we recommended was that, and Congress will have to help with this too, that OPM shift from a focus on compliance to a focus on enterprise risk management, and that agencies be allowed the freedom that they need to execute the appropriate personnel management practices and policies that best enable support of their mission. So all of those big ideas, are very consistent with the writings that NAPA has done in the past about making federal human capital a mission-focused exercise that still is consistent with merit principles. But really, we think that there needs to be a lot more flexibility for the agencies to take the steps that they need, with the idea that those should all be integrated and focused on mission accomplishment.
So, and then it's how do we get there? So we took a little bit different stance, but came to the same place. First is we need to honor and respect the workforce. We have to look at how the expectations of both organizations and the workforce are changing and how OPM supports that. But we started with the need to first build the capacity for civil service reform, So, and as you know, since 1978, there's been so many pieces of legislation that have danced around the edges or given a single agency a certain authority and not a broad authority. OPM just has Title V and not the other pieces. So it becomes this puzzle where the pieces just won't fit together. And we need to pull that together. We also, similarly to you, made the recommendation of no longer fees, appropriated funds, and creating an organization within OPM that is innovation and data to start looking into the future of work and how the government needs to prepare for that. And I know there's, even today, there's conversations now with COVID around how do we come back to work with telework? What's the appropriate parental leave? All those things are good and important to do, but nobody's taking a strategic look at the workforce or the needs of agencies or how they need to evolve in building that. And we even went as far as saying, at least for a transformational period, the OPM director that is Senate confirmed needs to be a term appointment, a 5 to 8 year term appointment, similar to IRS or Census or GAO, to really carry this transformation forward, because it's a generation in the making.
Well, you're right. You hit on a lot of things there. I mean, I would point out we are 6 months into the Biden-Harris administration, and we don't have a confirmed director of OPM. And as you also pointed out, the transition in that position has been brutal for the agency. So from our perspective, we're talking about a multi-year cultural change for that organization that would be enabled by some changes in statute that would broaden its mission. But that can't happen until that director is confirmed. And so if we're going to be serious about really driving both mission and focus change and culture change within that organization, we do need that director to get confirmed as quickly as possible. The NAPA study didn't make a recommendation to change the term of the OPM director because it is already a 4-year term. We thought it would just be great if somebody could actually stay for 4 years.
Yes.
Before we tried to make it a longer term. And we also didn't make specific recommendations about reorganizing functions. But what we tried to do instead was say, these are the functions that are necessary, including the data analytics, including the policy shop, including the training and guidance and certification of the human capital workforce across the federal government, so that we could give the flexibility to the OPM director to think about how that should be structured, while at the same time saying, these are the important things that you need to make sure that you include.
So in today's world, and I shouldn't say today's world because I've been talking about this for, it seems like, my whole career, getting the Hill and the administration to pay attention to this. This is not the sexy thing, right? It's and yes, we've got immigration and we've got gun reform and we've got the politics of the day. I spend a lot of time up on the Hill. You spend time on the Hill and with the administration. I meet with them often on the president's management agenda, and there's always a piece in there. But how do we get the powers to really pay attention to this? Because I actually think there is a return on investment and there's a return on expectations to be had, which is desperately needed for our government.
You raise a really good point. There are a lot of things on the plates of members of Congress, and getting elevation of civil service and OPM to rise to the level that gets their attention is an important conversation. We did make a recommendation that Congress should reestablish the civil service subcommittees in both the House and Senate oversight committees. Of all the recommendations in the report, that was probably the least favorably received. But that said, I think it's because the oversight committees feel that they are recommitting to this idea of reform. And we hope that the specific recommendations that we've made in the report and the ones that you've made in your report are getting that attention. Because again, our report specifically identified about 5 or 6 things that Congress needs to do, both statutory changes, but also funding changes in terms of shifting OPM to a more predictable appropriation cycle, allowing them the flexibility to establish a working capital fund that would support their IT investments. And we're hearing pretty positive responses to that. So, hope is not a method, but I do have my fingers crossed that we may see some engagement on that, in the next legislative cycle.
Well, I think there's opportunity, and I'm hoping 2022 is the year for this, and we're trying to gear up for that as well. I have a lot of conversations that still dance around the edges a little bit more than I'm interested. And our recommendation was actually a select committee and more engagement between the legislative and executive branches in order to really carry this forward, which is interesting. You mentioned a working capital fund. We can also see using the TMF, Technology Management Fund, for this. And I recently had a meeting on the Hill with Senator Probst and brought that up, and they were almost surprised that that was a possibility for OPM, but desperately needed. Where do you see technology as an enabler here and in terms of carrying human capital management forward?
Well, many processes in OPM are still sort of paper-based.
Retirement.
Right. So there's been a lot of conversation about it finally making the investment in an employee master file that can move with employees across agencies as they transition, simplifying the retirement system or the insurance system. But I do think one of the cultural changes that would be important here is for OPM to think about customer and employee experience and use that to drive their technology strategy. Mm-hmm. It's not just the retirement system that needs an update. It's OPM's outward-facing websites and engagement, and how do people submit applications and process those kinds of things through. So there's a whole approach to customer experience and employee experience that should inform their IT investment strategy. And so, what we recommended in the report is the first thing is you need an investment strategy. Before you get money for it, you need a strategy, and one that can be followed through, again, with folks who stay in the position long enough to see the change through, whether it's through the TMF, which I don't understand that OPM is prohibited from participating in now. They just don't have the strategy to inform the request. But a working capital fund then helps to organize the user fees and the sustainment of those investments going forward. Right. So both pieces have to come together, and it has to happen, as you mentioned sort of at the beginning of your question, in a real partnership between the executive branch, the legislative branch, well, I really should say the White House, the agencies, and the legislative branch, that they really have to intentionally create a partnership, whether it's a select committee, whether it's the existing committees. It's with OMB that documents and promotes those budget requirements. It's with Congress that says we're going to appropriate to that. It's with OPM and the White House committing to sustainment of people and strategy to see it through. All of that is really complex. It's a huge change management problem, but we can't not do it because it's hard.
Well, that's one of my favorite sayings. We can't not do it just because it's hard. And, within that construct, the technology investment and making sure, and you talked about cultural alignment at OPM and at other places, you're absolutely right. All those things are necessary. EHRI was built in 2003 for the purpose of being able to exchange records across the government, and it never got there. And now we're on our 19th year of that system, which needs to be replaced with something much more powerful. But within your answer is also things like employee self-service, which in the private sector has been around for a very, very long time. If you want to change your W-4 or add a beneficiary to your health insurance or life insurance, you just get online and do it. You don't have to walk down to HR. You don't fill out a form. You get online and do that. I recently was talking with a Chico, and I was talking about the self-service concept, and they said, oh, that's just a road too far from where we are now. But it needs to be part of the strategy. And, retirement now should be able to be done at the push of a button, if you will, with a system that tracks your career, but also things like making the employee's portfolio, if you will, retirement portfolio, HR portfolio, portable, where they can easily go from agency to agency. They can go outside the government and come back in. All these things need to be part of that strategy. And that strategy is necessary before we spend money on the technology.
Well, exactly right. So I think you just circled back to the point I made, which is all of that investment should be informed from a customer experience and an employee experience perspective. What does it take to make it easy for people who want to engage with OPM to do that? And how do you satisfy those kinds of requirements while, of course, still meeting all your privacy requirements and your security requirements and those kinds of things? So I would not want to be the CIO for OPM. It's a bridge beyond my understanding, but I think we can all agree that the urgency of this really is compelling, and that there are strategies out there that they can use to inform an integrated IT modernization approach that then has to be appropriated so that they can make those strategic investments. It has to be supported by an organization that is committed to that change. And they need the flexibility, I think, through a working capital fund to sustain those investments and continue to modernize them over time. It may look, even if they do get to the point of investing, the world of human capital technology is changing constantly. So you don't want to invest in a modern boulder today that 20 years from now is an ancient boulder. It's got to have that capacity to change and grow over time.
And to be, that's why that's not just the technology strategy, but the strategic capacity to be looking out into the future and how the world of work is changing, how agency needs are changing. We don't know today what the government spends on human capital. We know what payroll is, we know what benefits are. We don't know what they spend on HR capacity. We don't know what they spend on HR technology. We don't know where all the duplication, overlap, and fragmentation is. And there's so much to be gained by doing this right. But you also bring up a point earlier about, sort of history. Back in 2006, when they attempted an automated retirement system, spent about $250 million. It swore we're never going to give them another dime. And, here we are 15 years later, and there's still that hesitancy and it's time to give that up, get the right people in place, get the right strategy in place, fund it appropriately for a return on expectation and a return on investment to get there.
Well, it is a really hard problem. And just as a frame of reference, DOD and VA had been working for over a decade to share a veterans health record. Mm-hmm. And they finally organizationally got to the point that they could agree on what the requirements were. And now they're moving forward. I think, in these kinds of issues with human capital, it's the same.
It is, right? Very much so.
We need to agree on what a baseline is. And that may mean that some organizations or perspectives need to give up or share autonomy around that. But once you can get to a shared set of perspectives and requirements, then you also have to have the commitment to see it through. You can't keep changing it after that point. You have to make the investment, you have to see it through. But the new models of agile IT procurement and software development, I think, give you a lot more flexibility in that way than the old sort of waterfall approaches. So, I'm optimistic, but again, everything that you and I are saying hinges on the same thing. It's people with the expertise to do it, with the commitment to stick around long enough to get it done. And that's been the perpetual challenge for OPM.
For a very long time. So there's certainly things, and we both talked about some of these things that legislatively need to be done. And I'm a real believer that a lot of these things need to be done before we attack civil service reform, mm-hmm. which is needed too, but we've got to get ready for that. That's the whole point of making sure we build the capacity first. But what are some of the things you think that the administration can do without legislation, perhaps?
Well, there are a number of these that are sort of administrative inside OPM, right? You could rebuild the strategic planning capacity. Mm-hmm. You don't need the legislation to do that. You could, in many cases, shift to the risk management approach. There are some statutory relief measures that OPM would need to simplify their compliance role, and they will always have a compliance role. We're not in any way advocating that they give up that compliance.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But there is a shift to ERM that could happen without statutory obligations. Mm-hmm. OPM could really implement cost analytics that would help them know their costs mm-hmm. and be able to plan in advance for appropriations, right? Position themselves to be ready to move in that direction. So there are a number of things that the administration could do, including, bringing the OPM director in for a seat at the table as the president's strategic HR advisor. rebuilding a partnership relationship between OMB and OPM that can sustain that kind of functionality. So there are things that they can do without statute. What they can't do without statute is really get to the strategic leadership across all sectors of the federal civil service.
Yeah, and we went as far as saying there needs to be a review of the DDM function within OMB to better support this. And we recommended during transition a human capital business advisory function, very much like the DoD Business Board that looks at reforms in DoD, but to be an advisor to the director and guide and have some reporting requirements to get there. What would you think some of the very next steps are?
Well, I think they are the ones that I just suggested that could be done without statutory approval, right? Looking internally to rebuild the strategic planning and policy guidance function. Thinking strategically about the flexibilities that are permitted to agencies, at least under the Title V rules right now. So that, for example, when an organization does a demonstration project, that the flexibility that's learned from that demonstration project is not kept in that individual silo, but is made flexible for, or made accessible to all agencies once you have a new practice. We certainly advocate for the IT investment planning and strategy piece. That doesn't have to wait. Again, the cost analysis and accounting doesn't have to wait. The data analytics capacity doesn't have to wait. But you do need an OPM director with the vision to implement this kind of change management and to begin the process. Agreed.
And I mean, I heard several months ago she was out of committee favorably, and we're just waiting for a vote. So how long it'll take to get there. I fully agree with you. I like to see OPM getting these plans in place now, really moving it forward and working on selling them, getting the strong director in, and having what I call a champion for this change who will drive it. And then let's start the hearings on the Hill. Let's bring those that are really interested in these infrastructure reforms to the forefront, and hold OPM and OMB accountable for the investments that are made in terms of performance, productivity, forward-looking capacity, the technological capacity to create the efficiencies and effectiveness, and those kinds of things.
Well, you know, OPM has a real challenge. Not only are we asking them to think about these big strategic issues, but they have really thorny tactical problems to deal with. You started by talking about how do they bring people back to work? What are the really complicated legal structures around that? And so they've got to be both tactical and strategic at the same time. And that's a hard thing for any organization to do. It's especially hard for this organization to do because they've been so challenged with leadership and stability over time. So I don't want in any way to make this sound like it's easy. Why don't you just take this on? Why aren't you done yet? They have a really hard set of challenges in front of them. And so all of us really want to see them succeed. And I think, you know, your organization's resources, ours, so many others who are invested in this space really want to make sure that that organization is successful. You know, NAPA has written several papers, the No Time to Wait, 1 and 2, where we started from an idea of, you know, do we really need a central personnel agency entity to manage the federal civil service? And at the end of the day, very deliberately and with great consideration, we said, yes, you do. You can't manage over 2 million people and their associated contractual support workforces without a strong central entity. But as you and I've been discussing here, that central entity needs to be reframed, and it needs to be strategically focused, and it needs to be thinking about forward-looking policy and the competency of the HR workforce, and it needs to be modern in how it thinks about using data to predict and inform. And so they've got a real challenge ahead of them.
They certainly do. And I've met several times with the Chico Council around this. They're very supportive of both sets of recommendations, and they're eager to engage on how they can support and help drive these forward and be a help to OPM. They really, the Chicos actually believe in the central need for the function, and they want to see OPM grow and capacity and capability to support. So I wanted to say thank you for taking this time. Terry Gerton, the president of the National Academy of Public Administration. I really appreciate the time we spent. Let's see if we can move this forward.
Steve, I'm so happy to have been able to join the conversation. Thank you. And this is important work. We're definitely partners in it.
And let's see if we can keep it going. Good. Thank you, Terry. Thanks for watching this episode of Congress to Cubicle, where we look at the efficiency, effectiveness, and credibility of our government. If you have any comments or questions, you can always reach me at steve@center4oe.com. That's CENTER, the number 4, the letters OE.com. You can see the podcast on our YouTube channel, get it on our website, or visit all the major podcast channels. We appreciate your coming. Look forward to the next one. Take care.